In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. We are not only at the culmination of John's Gospel because it's chapter 21 and it happens to be the last, but we're at the culmination of all that John wants us to know about who is this person, Jesus. Here we see him today cooking and serving breakfast to his friends. But it's not just about the food. It's also about the covenantal love of God for his people. Love in John's Gospel is always a covenantal love. It is the love of God that binds God to his people and his people to God. At the beginning of chapter 13, John wrote, "Having loved his own, he loved them to the end." That verse is almost like a fulcrum. It points back and it points forward. It points back to John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, to the end that all who believe in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And that verse points forward to where we are today, when Jesus looks at Simon and says, "Simon, do you love me?" God's love language is always covenantal language, because it is the language which promises restoration. We're told in John's Gospel that God came into this world as a person, came into the world that he made as a person, as light in the darkness. You'll remember way back at Christmas, we heard, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. And we have seen his glory, the glory as the only begotten Son of the Father." John makes it clear from the very beginning that God has come to dwell with his people. He's come to live with them. He's come to pitch his tent, which is actually what the word means in Greek. Or, as Eugene Peterson put in his interpretation of the New Testament called The Message, God moved into the neighborhood. The glory of God, the glory of the God of Israel, has moved into the neighborhood. That's the glory that departed from the temple at the time of the exile. And nowhere in any of the post-exilic writings are we told that that glory has returned, although it's in Augie for sure. But John says it has returned. Not in a temple building, but as and in a human being. On the cross, on Good Friday, we heard the words, "It is finished." That is the way most English translations express Jesus' last words in John. But "it is finished" does not mean it's been stopped, it's over, it's enough. It doesn't mean any of that, which is what our Western minds tend to think. The Greek word means "it has been completed." Or the wonderful German word, which is in Bach's St. John's Passion, "Es ist vollbracht." It's been brought to the full. The work of redemption has been brought to the full. The victory of all victories, as we were just singing, has been brought to the full. And Jesus knows that the task of his disciples is to bear witness to what has been accomplished. It is not their job to fight back. It is not their job to shrink in fear. It's not their job to shriek at how awful this all was. It's their job to bear witness with their lives, with their community, with their faith, to the different sort of kingdom that has come into this world and is revealed through this strange glory of the God of Israel. N.T. Wright wrote in one of his books, God is calling people who have perhaps made a bit of a mess of things up until now, but whom Jesus is looking at with love and new creation and healing and inviting them to celebrate with him, and then to work with him and for him, that his sheep may be fed and that his world may be healed. Because there is more work still to be done, and we who breakfast with Jesus today must be prepared first for the long walk on the shore, and then for the still longer walk to follow Jesus wherever he leads. In John's gospel today, the glory of God in the flesh issues a direct call. Come and have breakfast. That's not his only invitation, his only call in the New Testament. John begins his gospel with an invitation, a call from Jesus. And what we see every time Jesus issues an invitation is he invites people to himself, to live with him. That's what happened back in the first chapter of John when the disciples said, "Where do you live? Where are you from?" And Jesus said, "Come and see. Come and live with me. Come and dwell with me." It must have been a powerful experience because the next day, Philip went out and said the exact same thing to Nathanael, using the exact same words. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus said, "Come and learn." He told the disciples, "Come and learn from me. Come to me for relief. Come to me for release from your incessant need to be self-sufficient." He told them that born alone, the yoke and the burden are unbearable. Come and learn from me, because my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Because I, Jesus, bear it. In Mark's gospel, he said to the disciples, "Come and rest. Rest from the task at hand." He knew that his followers were going to be their most effective when they also took time to rest. In Matthew, he said, "Come and inherit." Jesus is the embodiment of God's eternal plan for his children. And that plan is to share in his glory in his kingdom. The glory which Jesus had with the Father before the world ever began. Come and inherit, he said. And then today, he simply said, "Come and have breakfast." Today, he invited the disciples to his resurrected self. The resurrected self who is still the one who serves and will continue to serve those who would come. Basically, Jesus is saying, come and surrender. He knew, and he still knows, that the struggles that his followers will endure begin anew every day. And he knew that the gift of God in him is also new every day. The writer of Lamentations, long before the time of Jesus, said, "The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh every morning. I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance. Therefore, I will hope in him." "Come and have breakfast," he said. Peter needed this invitation. You and I need this invitation. Peter. This is the same guy who in the upper room before the crucifixion said, "Well, don't just wash my feet, wash all of me." And then a few seconds later, he said, "I'm ready to die for you, Jesus." To which Jesus said, "Ha! You will deny me 3 times. And of course, he did. Beside a charcoal fire. And where is Peter today? Beside a charcoal fire. Peter arrived at the tomb. He arrived in the upper room on that first night of the resurrection, and he arrived today at the Sea of Tiberias with Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and the other disciples. He arrived to do something, to go fishing. He needed this invitation from Jesus. Jesus wants to make clear to his disciples that the events of the last days, he knows it's left them totally untethered, scared, vulnerable. He knows that connections have been strained and broken. Who was there? Who deserted? Who got Jesus' mother? And Jesus also knows that connections are important to the disciples' ability and our ability to go forward. Some of you during Lent read Brené Brown's book, Daring Greatly. She has said that to connect, to have a connection, you have to be seen as who you are. And in the case of Peter, as in the case of you and me, that means to be seen as being vulnerable. We want to be connected. But there is a catch-22 in all of this. Those with a strong sense of connection and belonging believe they're worthy. And the one thing that keeps us from connections is our fear that we are unworthy. Folks who live with a deep sense of worthiness also have a sense of courage. That is, who they are with their whole being. They have a sense of compassion, of being kind to yourself first. And they have connections, which are gotten through authenticity. Folks with a deep sense of worthiness also fully embrace vulnerability, because they believe that what made them vulnerable makes them beautiful. Have you ever thought about the fact that vulnerability is necessary to be able to say, "I love you"? Because there are no guarantees. Vulnerability At the core, we often see shame and fear. But vulnerability is also the birthplace of joy. Now, we live in a vulnerable world, and so we, like Peter, can be numb to the vulnerability. And we may try as hard as we want, but we cannot selectively numb that sense of vulnerability. We can't say, okay, here's the bad stuff that I don't want. Shove it aside. Because when we try to do that, what do we end up doing? Our vulnerable self has a couple of drinks and a Dutch kitchen dessert because we hope it's going to make us feel better. When we're numb to those areas, those vulnerable areas, we're also numb to joy, to gratitude, and to happiness. And then we're miserable. And we go looking for meaning, and we repeat the same two steps I just mentioned. Jesus wants to restore Peter to worthiness, to restore his courage, his compassion, his connection. And he chooses to do it over a meal. Today, we live in a world where we make the uncertain certain. And when we do that, we become more afraid and more vulnerable. We can pretend, we can try to be perfect, or, like Peter, we can allow ourselves to be seen and engaged by the God who loves us. That God in Jesus said, "Come and have breakfast." That was a most vulnerable moment for Peter and for the other disciples. He had no idea where any conversation might go. He had no idea, deep in his heart, what Jesus might think of him, knowing what he had done. But Jesus came to connect. He came to connect with his disciples in their vulnerability and to infuse them with God's covenantal love and glory, just as he did on the Damascus Road for Saul. He wanted to infuse them with that covenantal love and glory because he knew that that would restore their worthiness. The worthiness which he knew all along and which he had died for. He was going to restore that so that they might do in this world what he knew they were called to do and were able to do. As the Father sent me, so I send you. There is a monumental task ahead for Peter and all of the disciples, and us. We know how it ended up for Peter and all those disciples. But we who breakfast today with Jesus must, like Peter, be prepared to follow him, to bear witness to what he has accomplished for his world, to bear witness to God's glory and God's covenantal love in this world. And as N.T. Wright said, to first follow him on the shore, and then for the even longer walk, to follow Jesus wherever he leads. Amen.